All right. Thanks so much, John and Tyler, for the invite and the introduction, as well as to everyone who's here tonight on Friday night. So hopefully I'll make it worth your while, or do the best I can. So I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully this will work out okay. Everybody seeing those slides all right? Good, okay. So yeah, I hope you'll find this topic of relevance to your current situation, or the current situation we all find ourselves in, and hopefully find you managing okay. But maybe some of the things I'll talk about tonight might be useful as you go along and think about managing, the stress and anxiety that so many of us deal with all the time, and especially now during global pandemic, social injustice and unrest, a lot of things to be anxious about. And I'm a professor in psychology. I'm also in the neuroscience program, and I'm the current director of clinical training. So I'm also a clinician and a licensed psychologist in Michigan. And so I really come at the research that I do from a practical standpoint. At the end of the day, yeah, I do neuroscience, and I'm interested in the brain, and I'm interested in how these things work. But really, what I want to be able to do is make it so folks can manage their stress and anxiety better. At the end of the day, I really do want the work that we do to speak to people's struggles that they're having. So this is a question actually I've been grappling with now a lot for the past probably 5 or so years. Being a therapist myself and being a clinician, we have strategies that are helpful, and we have therapies that are pretty good. The trouble is, though, a lot of the therapies that we use and the way that we think about developing therapies and delivering therapies, at the end of the day, is pretty effortful for people. They're pretty hard strategies that I try to teach my clients to use to manage their stress and anxiety. And that's kind of the conundrum that I've been trying to deal with now for a while with some real close collaborators over at the University of Michigan, where we're really asking this question: can we make it more manageable for folks to regulate their stress and anxiety? And what can psychological and brain science tell us about that? So we don't have to look very far in general, but especially now, to find stress and anxiety in our lives, and images of it kind of everywhere you look. So stress and anxiety has always interested me just because of how relevant it is to our daily life. And when I'm talking about managing our stress and anxiety, what I'm really talking about is our ability to alter this emotional experience and the expression of it across all the various kind of response systems we have as humans, right? We can either verbalize that. I can tell you that I'm stressed out. I can show you that I'm stressed out by maybe kind of looking scattered and walking about or pacing. I can show that physiologically too. I can show that by a sweat response or a furrowing brow or shaky palms, as well as in the brain, which is what I'll talk about too. And what we all try to do, in a sense, when we're managing our stress and anxiety, is we're trying to alter the intensity of it. Can we make it less strong? Can we make it less long? So we're altering the duration, how long it lasts, and exactly kind of how it feels to us in that moment. Doing so is really critical to our overall well-being and physical health. We know now more than ever how much stress and anxiety has a negative impact on people's long-term health, not just their mental health, but their physical health. And in general, what we call this notion and this topic of managing our anxiety or managing our emotional experiences in the area of research I work in is emotion regulation. So how do we regulate our emotions? And in this case, talking about the negative ones of stress and anxiety. So what I'll be kind of getting at tonight is, how do we go about regulating our emotions? What are the strategies that we oftentimes use? What are the brain mechanisms that are involved in trying to regulate our emotions? And so just a few kind of common emotion regulation strategies, hopefully you'll all find very familiar. that we study in the lab when we try to understand and how useful they can be for certain people, under this kind of broad category of reappraisal. You might know it more kind of like reinterpretation or thinking differently. There are different kinds of thinking differently to change your emotions. You can detach yourself. Some people do it this way. Oh, this experience is not real. I'm just going to shut down my emotions. I think about just saying, I'm not going to feel anything about this. I'm going to move on. Positive reappraisal or positive reinterpretation. You might say this to yourself or other friends. Oftentimes, look on the bright side. Think about it more positively. It's not as bad as you think, sort of thing. Other folks might just try to hide the way that they express their feelings through suppression. So try not to show that they're actually feeling any negative emotions, like your poker face sort of idea. As well as we oftentimes use distraction. So think about something else altogether or do something else altogether to try to make yourself feel less stressed or anxious. And so all of these are strategies that I've used. I'm guessing many of you have used at various times. And you'll find that sometimes they're helpful, sometimes they're not. You might find yourselves relying on certain ones more than others. And so there's no kind of overarching really like, oh, this is a good one or this is a bad one in general, but how you use them and in what situations you use them can give you a sense of how useful they're going to be for you, kind of when and where and how. And so where my research has come in and really kind of looked at this idea of managing stress and anxiety and starting kind of in a basic sense of, well, what is our understanding of how people achieve this emotion regulation? What is the basic machinery in our brains that's involved in doing this, right? And I think this is now kind of broadly accepted and kind of more even in lay kind of in lay areas and lay understanding that we have this kind of deep in the deep part of our brain, right? We have these emotional centers in the brain, and this little map is showing you kind of the classic almond-shaped amygdala that you might have heard now that it's oftentimes in pop culture. This emotional part of the brain lights up when you're feeling some sort of negative emotion oftentimes. And that the way that we manage that in the brain is we take that big front part of our brain and we tone it down, right? We think about things and we say, hey, stop, put the brakes on. And so we use this part of our front of our brain, prefrontal cortex, those sorts of areas that they're called, to really put the brakes on and stop these negative emotions. And this is more or less how brain science understands and how we think of, I think even in lay language, how we think of managing our emotions. You use the front part of your thinking brain to shut down the more primitive part of your emotional brain. Okay, fine. So that's kind of where we started with this work and trying to use a number of neural measures in the lab using electroencephalogram. These are little electrical and blips in the brain, the waves in the brain, as well as functional neuroimaging, where these are blobs on brains that you might see, like I was just showing you. We use a combination of these strategies to get at kind of when certain emotion regulation strategies have their effects and where they have their effects in the brain, to ultimately address this question of what can psychological and brain science tell us about more versus less manageable regulation strategies. Which ones might be easier, which ones might be harder, and then ultimately for me is how do we use that knowledge to then leverage the kind of easiest or most applicable emotion regulation strategies to people across situations. And that's kind of the upshot. Some people like John, use wine. That's also one of those helpful emotion regulation strategies that is quite common, in moderation, of course. Me, on the other hand, I'm here getting all hopped up on tea, so I'll try to chill it out and get through the rest of the presentation. Then I'll have my wine. So how do we study emotion regulation in the lab, especially if we want to look at brain, mechanisms involved here, which happen very quickly, right? I mean, this stuff is happening so rapidly all the time. So usually what we do is we have somebody sit down, we put them in the EEG cap that we have them wear, we put them in the scanner, and we present things to them on a computer screen. And usually we present them with some cue like this, some word that says, I want you to regulate your emotions in some way. And I tell you kind of what I want you to do ahead of time. And every time you see this cue, regulate, I want you to think differently about the situation. I want you to suppress your emotions, whatever it is for that particular experiment. And then after that, I usually show you some sort of emotional evocative image. And I ask you to regulate your feelings to that image that I'm going to show you. Many of these things we see in everyday life and news and things like that. I'm just going to flash an example of it really quickly. It may be, I hope it is not a triggering image for you. It might be, and I'll try to flash through it really quickly because of that. But just to give you a sense of, these are really meant to be evocative images to get emotions in the lab that would be analogous to some stress you might feel in real life. So something, you know, that feels like it might evoke emotion. Okay, various versions of that. Okay, so we have this task where we have people, you know, cued to regulate their emotions. They see this picture, and then what we're looking for, just to give you a sense of what EEG looks like in these sorts of tasks, we look at kind of two types of signals from the brain, very similar to what I just showed you with the kind of fMRI or functional neuroimaging images, where you get a signal in the front of the head that indicates somebody's trying to control their emotions. They're using effort to control their emotions. And then you have a signal in the back of their head, which is really kind of a signal from that kind of more primitive part of the brain, the amygdala. It also shows up at the back of your head in where we usually see visual information processed, because this is visual information I'm giving them. I'm giving you a visually evocative image. Your amygdala lights up. It makes your whole kind of visual part of your brain light up too, because it's like, whoa, this is important. This is kind of scary. I should do something here. What should I do about it? And these are the sort of head maps and brain maps that we get to look at emotion regulation in the lab. These are the brain blips that we look at. I'm not going to show you more of these sorts of pictures because they are kind of confusing and they're just, you know, a lot to track. So I just want to give you a sense of, these are the sorts of things I'm looking at all the time, these little brain squiggles. Some are bigger, some are smaller than others. And we use this on a real, you know, short time scale. We're looking at the brain's activity on the scale of milliseconds. So your brain is doing these operations within a tenth of a second, working on these emotions of stress and anxiety so quickly. These are the sort of waves that we look at in the lab. To kind of just get to the punchline though, all this, you know, the studies that we end up doing, for example, here's a study where we looked at detached reappraisal, where you just say, oh, I'm gonna not feel anything. This is probably fake or from a movie, this image I'm seeing. What you get in the green is a reduction in that emotional part of the brain. I showed you the red part in the back of the brain. You get a reduction of this emotional signal really early on, even before a second. You already see the brain able to kind of decrease the emotional response you get, and then that continues later on a few seconds into watching this image. So this kind of strategy of detachment really shuts off your emotional activity really quickly. And in some instances, that's really helpful. But in a lot of the work that we're doing too, we're looking at this control signal. So while it may be a strategy that helps you shut off this emotion quickly, which you might want to do, it also comes at a cost. That this is an example of one of the control front brain signals. It comes at a cost of effort. You have to engage a good amount of effort and control the emotion when you detach versus when you're just kind of passively looking at one of these pictures. So it takes effort, it takes control to manage the emotions, and it's a significant amount. We see this in the brain. People tell us when we ask them afterwards, oh yeah, that took a good amount of effort to control my emotions to those really evocative images. And we see this kind of pattern over and over again. And this is very similar to kind of that canonical or that prototypic pattern of brain activity I showed you with the neuroimaging, where the front part of the brain lights up and controls the kind of emotional part of the brain. So what we've done over the years is kind of look at a bunch of different types of strategies to figure out what the neural time course, the brain time course, looks like for this. And it's very consistent with what I showed you at the top of the talk, where for things like detached reappraisal, where I say, hey, let me not think about this, it's fake, it's not real. Let me suppress my outward expression of emotions, or let me distract myself when I'm looking at these images. You generally get these brain signals that indicate you're able to shut off emotions early, and they require effort or control to do so. Okay, so they all kind of are very similar that way. These three strategies, even though they're slightly different in how they work and how we think about them, they all kind of function similarly, where your emotions are shut off quickly, but it requires control to do so. and a significant amount of control to do so. Positive reappraisal is somewhat similar but different in that, because you're reinterpreting your feelings in a kind of more sophisticated way where you're trying to think more positively about the image you're looking at, it doesn't shut your emotions off right away. Like in that image I showed you before, you could say, oh, this guy's coming at me, but I dodge out of the way and I run to safety and I call the police, right? That takes a little more effort and a little more thought to get your way out of the negative emotion. So it takes a little while to unfold for positive reappraisal to do its work, but it still works well, and it still requires effort and control to do so. So it doesn't shut your emotions off. I actually like positive reappraisal a little better than the other strategies, because at least you're not just shutting your emotions off. In general, one minor little tip I would say is, somebody who's been at this for a long time, the more we tend to just shut our emotions off right away and avoid them without thinking too hard about them, it generally is associated with not great stuff. So that's not those, detached reappraisal, suppression, and distraction are not great strategies long-term to really lean on for, emotional health and stress and anxiety. Positive reappraisal is a little better at that, but it takes a little longer, requires effort as well. Okay. So it leads me to the problem, which I kind of alluded to in the question I asked at the beginning of my talk, for me at least, is regardless of the types of strategies that I reviewed, the distraction, reappraisal, positive reinterpretation, all of them, to be successful, all of them require effort and control. And the problem with that is that we find ourselves in a lot of different kinds of stressful situations all the time. And some of them are really stressful, such that those control mechanisms that we need in the front part of our brain are not really available, because those same stressful situations, we know from other research, sap those parts of our brain and tire us out, right? You know what that kind of fatigue feels like when you're stressed. Stress has that effect on the front part of our brain. So in highly stressful situations, just think about all the COVID fatigue we're all feeling over this time. Those stressful situations, they sap and they tax the very frontal resources we actually need to then regulate our emotions. So if we're still trying to rely on these effortful strategies, how are we going to make use of them if they're already drained? The other problem is not just for kind of everybody who finds themselves in particularly stressful situations, but what about the people who have chronic levels of stress and anxiety? They experience it that way for whatever reason, their situation. They might have a mental health diagnosis. Those folks also tend to have frontal, resources that are sapped and taxed as well. So when I ask my clients to call upon those controlled resources in the front part of the brain, they're saying, hey, look, I'd like to, but I'm tired, I'm sapped, I'm taxed, I'm burnt out here. I can't marshal those resources to then regulate my emotions in the moment. So how can we get around that? Are there ways to get around that? And that's what I'll spend the last part here talking more about. And so I just wanted to get, before I moved on to that last part, to give you some other alternative strategies to think about. I just wanted to show you a real quick example of what that looks like. In a study we did with high and low worried undergraduates who reported high or low stress and anxiety. On the top part, you have the worriers, the students who reported high worry. On the bottom, students who reported low worry. And in this case, that blue that you're seeing at the front of the head there suggested to us that actually the college students who reported more worry were the ones who worked harder to do positive reappraisal. They had more of that front brain activity because they were trying to figure out how to think more positively about these nasty images I was showing them, and they were having a hard time of it. And to boot, then they see the picture on the right-hand side, the image I'm showing you with the big red and blue blobs here. On the top, the students who had high worry, their brains turned bright red. And what that meant is it actually backfired. Trying to think positively backfired, and they experienced more emotion. Their brain processed much more emotion, much more negative emotion, whereas the undergraduates who experience less worry on the bottom, their brains were cooled off. They were able to positively reinterpret the images we showed them and feel better about it during the task that we did it. So these are exactly the people who we try in the clinic to work with, or in the situation we find ourselves in where we're all kind of on high alert. The kinds of strategies I just talked to you are exactly the ones that look like they might backfire for folks. So can we identify other strategies that are more manageable? And I'll talk about a couple that we've been studying and kind of toying with here for the past few years. So hopefully this audio will work, but I want to show you a brief clip just to demonstrate one strategy that we've worked on over the years, which is called third-person self-talk or distance self-talk. And I don't know if anybody recognizes this guy, but maybe if you're interested in basketball, or yeah, I guess he's kind of everywhere. LeBron James, many years ago, if people remember, used to, play for his hometown team, Cleveland, the Cleveland Cavaliers, and it was a great story. But at one point, he had the chance to move on to a bigger market, to move on to Miami. And ESPN, the major sports network, actually ran like a whole hour session called The Decision for him, where he talked through his decision making around moving from the Cleveland Cavaliers to the Miami Heat. And I just want you to focus on this real brief part in this clip and see if you notice something kind of interesting or odd that he did here in this little clip. Let's hope the audio works. Everybody able to hear that okay? No, you couldn't. Oh, shoot. I think there is a way to share my audio. Yeah, there it is. Okay, let's try this again.
One thing that I didn't want to do is make any.
Can you guys hear that? Okay, so I'm going to start that at the beginning and let you listen to the whole thing now that we can hear it.
One thing that I didn't want to do is make an emotional decision, and I wanted to do what was best, for LeBron James, and what LeBron James is going to do to make him happy.
All right, so everybody caught that, yeah? So, halfway through a sentence of him describing this emotional decision, right? He cues it with, I didn't want to make an emotional decision. He's using first-person pronouns, right? Then all of a sudden he says, I'm going to make an emotional decision. And he talks about himself in the third person twice. And so this is a little quirk. Some people say, oh, well, it could be due to narcissism, or, there are lots of people who talk about themselves in the third person out loud in public. There are others who have done it who we might not think are so, maybe more narcissistic or grandiose. I don't know if folks know about Malala. Malala, who was the young woman who was terrorized by the Taliban. She actually gave an interview and talked about how when she was assaulted and shot, actually, she talked about that situation and how she recovered. And at one point during the emotional interview, she referred to herself in the third person. She said, Malala, you have to hit him with a shoe. You have to get out of there. So we thought of this is not just a quirk of language, but actually something people do on purpose, maybe not even knowing that using third person allows people to get distance from their emotional experiences and regulate their emotions pretty automatically. So we took this idea and we said, can we get people to do this in the lab, and might it work as an emotion regulation strategy that we could later leverage to help folks? And so that's what we did, and that's really exactly what we found. We had folks come in and do this same sort of regulation task in the lab, and what you see there in the dark gray bars is the lower emotional response early and later in this emotional response brain activity when people reflected on their feelings to the images they saw using their own name, as compared to when they use first person pronouns like I. So I'd be like, Jason is really scared that guy would come towards him and try to stab him, versus I was afraid that this guy would come towards me and stab me, and think about those experiences using your own name. And so we were able to find that just switching to thinking to yourself in the third person could reduce this emotional reaction in the moment. We also saw that in a neuroimaging study. We did it as well. Here, the little blobs that you see on the front part of the brain and the amygdala, these are actually greater activations for using your first person pronouns like I, whereas we saw none of these types of activations for a third person. There was no control brain activity that lit up, but the emotional part of the brain was quieted down by just this little quirk of language using your own name rather than first person pronouns. And so we felt pretty good about this kind of quirky little study we did, but we've replicated this now. And we've also shown that if you take this out of the lab and you actually ask people to do this and reflect on situations that they find anxious in the future, or if they reflect on situations that they found anxiety provoking in the past, either way, and you'll see on the kind of horizontal axis there too, regardless of how intense the emotional experience was or that people anticipate, the emotional experience people have is always less if you use this third person self-talk in the blue line. It's always decreased if you think about these experiences from a third person perspective rather than a first person perspective. You always have this gain of feeling less negative. And we see this across a number of different types of situations too. So this little quirk of language that you can get people to use, where you ask them to reflect on and think about their own experiences, present, like looking at the images, in the past, or things that you're anticipating in the future, using your own name to kind of talk to yourself or coach yourself down can be really effective and not effortful. And last, I want to touch on a more real recent study that we just did, leveraging the idea of placebos. And so traditionally, placebos are given in, medication trials where we're trying to see, does the medication actually really do something above and beyond a sugar pill, right? That's kind of how we all think about it, to make sure that the active ingredient is really helping with the problem, whatever it is. And a newer concept beyond just placebos has been non-deceptive placebos. And the reason non-deceptive placebos have come into popularity is because the idea of a placebo is really fine and all, but you actually can't make use of a placebo in treatment at all because it involves lying to people, right? But what's really interesting about placebos also is they actually are quite powerful. If you look at studies across the board, and depression is one really good example. If you look at the placebo effect in depression, it's actually quite large. There was a big study done years ago now where they showed that for about 80% of depressed patients, a placebo pill worked just as well as an active antidepressant. 80%, that's the large majority of depressed patients who did just as well with a sugar pill as they did with an active antidepressant. And people were scratching their heads. And so the idea is that a placebo can actually be really helpful. It doesn't have side effects. It can actually be beneficial. And why it works, we think, is that you're ingesting something into your body which is an overlearned habit we all have of kind of ever since we were babies, right? We were being given things to soothe us by our parents, where we ingested something, we put something in our body, Tylenol, warm milk, whatever it is. We were with an authority figure like a parent, and we were with someone who wanted to show us care. And that learned habit, you can actually ascribe that learned habit to lots of different objects. And so that's what we think is also happening with the placebo for depressed patients, right? As you're being given something to put in your body with an authority figure who's a doctor who's telling you this is going to make you feel better. And so you take it and you have all these wonderful thoughts about how it's going to make you feel better, and then you do, even though there's no active ingredient in that pill. The problem is you have to lie to people, and you can't do that in routine practice, right? So we can't say, hey, doctors, give sugar pills to all your patients, tell them it's a real thing, and they'll all get better, and we'll save a lot of money in the pharmaceutical industry because it'll be much cheaper to create sugar pills than do all this other stuff. Doesn't really work. So non-deceptive placebos actually takes the lying away from it. It says you actually don't have to lie to people. You can actually still tell people that they're taking a non-active medication, but if they take it and they believe it will help them, it will. And there have been a number of demonstrations now across chronic back pain and depression, some anxiety. Most of it has come out of pain and some GI symptoms, gastrointestinal symptoms, that if you give somebody a placebo and tell them it's a placebo, they still report back that they feel better. And so this is kind of like groundbreaking ideas. How could this possibly be? What hadn't been shown, though, is, people worried. They're like, well, the reason that you're getting these benefits with this non-deceptive placebo is because people are just telling you what you want to hear. This is called demand effect or demand characteristics in experimental research. The problem is when you are involved in this sort of treatment study, people generally want to make you happy and they generally want to tell you what you want to hear. And they probably figured out you want them to tell you you're feeling better. And so they're like, well, then we really don't know if it's a real effect, right? No biological effect. So we sought to address that with emotion by looking in the brain if you can get one of these non-deceptive placebo sort of designs to work and reduce emotional brain activity. So what we did was we had people come in under the guise that they were going to be involved in a study on emotions and brain activity. For the we had a control group and we had a placebo group, and everyone in the study got this saline nasal spray. There was nothing in this nasal spray other than saline solution, something you might put in your nose just to clear up your sinuses. But in the placebo group, what we did was we showed them a video about how there's a lot of evidence that placebos can be actually really helpful. And that even if you're getting a saline nasal spray, if you believe that this nasal spray will make you feel better and less stressed when you view the images I'm about to show you, they will. So a suggestion, just telling them this will work. If you take this nasal spray and think it will make you feel better, it actually will. The control group, they just got instructions that said, hey, take this nasal spray. It's just going to help us get better physiological readings, which was not true. But it was just a control for us. Everybody got debriefed afterwards, and we're told what we were really doing. So we were hoping to see a reduction in emotional brain activity with people who took the placebo, even though they knew it was a placebo. And we found exactly that. In the placebo group, in the open circles here, they had a reduction in that emotional brain activity kind of within a second, and it continued on for a few seconds. You see on the right-hand side, the kind of hotter, warm brain on the top is the control group, and on the bottom is the non-deceptive placebo group, where they got this reduction, cool off in the brain to these emotional images. So even just thinking that some substance you take with an authority figure in the room to tell you, and with some suggestion that'll make you feel better, you have this automatic, natural shift in your brain that your brain starts to cool off and feel better. And these folks also reported feeling, less anxious about the situation as well. And the important piece is we saw no evidence that control regions of the brain were active. This happened automatically with very little effort and was successful in reducing their stress to these images. So as my last bit of data here, I just want to show you an extension we've just recently done with this. So we show it in the lab. That's kind of the way we do a lot of things. We try to show something in the lab, uncover its mechanisms, how it works in the lab, and then we try to translate that out to the real world. And so recently, with the help actually of a small grant from the College of Social Science, we've launched a non-deceptive placebo study for COVID stress and anxiety. So what we're doing is we're enrolling people in the non-deceptive placebo study group, as well as the control group, in a very similar way that we did in the lab. But what we do is we send the treatment group, the non-deceptive placebo group, we send them a bottle of these Zibo pills that you can actually buy for about 20 bucks for 45 capsules on Amazon, believe it or not. And they're called Zibo, and then right on the label, it says, pure honest placebo. They know they're getting a placebo. We call them up, we take them through a video on Zoom. We say, hey, we're going to send you some pills. We want you to take 2 of these each day. And we want you to think to yourself each time you're taking this, that I'm taking this to help my stress and anxiety. And if you really believe, based on all the evidence I just showed you, that placebos can be really helpful, if you keep thinking that this will make you feel better and you take them each day as prescribed, you'll feel better. And so I just have a sneak peek of some real recent data that is hot off the press. It's only 20 or so people, 20 or 30 people, but we're starting to see already that the non-deceptive placebo group in the red there line are reporting over time from baseline to a week later to 2 weeks later, and then even a final follow-up of 3 weeks later, they're reporting slightly less COVID-related stress than is the control group, with just getting this placebo, bottle of placebo pills, taking them and thinking through that this will make me feel better if I believe it. So the power of belief here is having biological effects on the brain, and then it's actually helping people manage in a fairly easy, straightforward way. So we're hoping this will hold up once we get a larger sample. So what I've hoped to been able to show you is that even though there are assumptions about the way we need to regulate our emotions requires this regulation of emotion by top-down cognitive control, by this effort, that's not necessarily the case. We've shown you that there are a range of strategies you can use, some more difficult than others, some kind of more automatic, some that take a bit longer. And ultimately, we're really interested in identifying these sorts of strategies that are easier to implement for the most success across a various range of stressful situations and for kind of the largest group of people possible. And that's really what we're trying to do, and we're after with these latest studies on self-talk and the non-deceptive placebo. Just wanted to give a shout out to all these awesome people who are helping me do this stuff in our lab and collaborators across various universities, and thanking you all for your close attention tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Moser. That was a really good presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And so now we're going to move on to
Hey,
Yeah,
sorry,
go ahead.
Tyler. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Should I stop sharing, or should I leave it in case people want me to pop around on slides or anything?
Yeah, normally we have the people stop sharing, but
Okay, that's
if you
fine.
think that would be, I mean, if someone has a question about a specific graph or anything, you're welcome to resume
We
the
can always go
sharing.
back. Yeah,
Yeah.
that sounds good.
So, yeah, does anyone have any questions, comments, dreams, aspirations? All right, well, I'll get the ball rolling then. So you mentioned in the last slide how you're trying to work on creating strategies that aren't so much focused on the cognitive top-down approach that requires so much effort. So I guess my question would be, how does the non-deceptive placebo differ from a cognitive approach? Because it still seems like it requires a decent amount of you have to think about it, because you have to think about believing in it. So I guess having this, so how much, where's the difference there, I guess is my question.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and gets to kind of the bottom of how we think it works in the moment. So part of the challenge with regulating your emotions in the moment with some of these strategies where you have to rethink the situation while it's happening is that that's all happening at the same time, right? So you have to think hard while you're having the emotion at the same time and kind of work on it in real time all at once. The idea with the non-deceptive placebo, as one example, is that actually you've done the work already before you've even felt the emotions, right? So you wake up in the morning, you take 2 Zebo pills with your morning coffee, you're ready to go, right? You got the video, and so you did have to pay attention. There's some kind of investment, as you said, up front, right? By watching the video, getting that idea in your mind, and then taking the pills with it to get started. But the idea is that is front-ended work, so that then when you feel the emotion after the effect, which is the way that we did the study in the lab too, it's just automatic, essentially, is you've laid that groundwork and you've essentially switched the way that your brain processes new emotions, and so you don't have to rely on that top-down control or those thoughts in that moment, because your brain has already kind of, in a sense, been set at a lower threshold, kind of a higher threshold for tolerating those emotions when they come in. Does that make sense? That's the idea, at least. We got to keep thinking, working on that, but that's kind of the idea.
Oh, that does make sense. Thank you for that. Actually, 2 follow-up questions about the placebo popped up in the chat. So Marianne asked, how do you make yourself believe that the placebo is helping you? And then Pete asked, that's also a placebo-related question, does the non-deceptive placebo technique work better with certain personality types than others, or certain people?
Yeah, those are great follow-ups. So the first one to Marianne's question is, that takes, so let me first say, not everybody's going to believe it. Okay. There's a very, I'm sure most people realize this on this call, right? There's a lot of resistance to the placebo effect, right? People are like, come on. People don't like to be tricked. People don't like to be lied to. People don't like to think that a sugar pill could actually help them feel better, right? There is that general tide that I think the research is working against. So what has generally been done, and what we do in the lab, is we just take people through the evidence. We show them. We say, hey, I'm going to show you it takes, my postdoc right now, Darwin Guevara, who's done a lot of this work. What he does is he gets them on the phone and on Zoom, and he takes them through a PowerPoint showing people time and time again, look at how placebo worked for anxiety. Look how a placebo, like real evidence, right? Real research. Look at how a placebo worked for chronic pain. All these things that you kind of scratch your head. How could it possibly be that a non-active ingredient could make me feel less pain? How could it make me feel less depressed? How could it make my GI symptoms clear up a little bit? And we take them through the evidence, and a lot of it is kind of, I gotta see it to believe it. And we try to help the belief by showing them the actual evidence for it, and walking them through the idea also, kind of how it works, how we think it works in terms of changing the brain's kind of way it receives information in the first place. So that's part of the answer there. In terms of Pete, your question about personality types, I think that's a fascinating question, one that we have to grapple with moving forward. I think there are a lot of people who are just going to be resistant to the idea, and that's not going to be necessarily useful to them. But we have shown that at least for anxious or neurotic personality types, at least, this effect does seem to hold. It doesn't seem to be dependent on people's anxiety level when they come in the door. So if they're more anxious, it seems like they might actually get a better effect if they come in more anxious or more neurotic. They get a stronger response, is what it seems like. But yeah, there are other types of personality traits, obviously, we'll have to deal with, and the resistance as well.
They're both excellent questions. The next question comes from Dr. Ford. She asked, does this research, I think she's specifically referring to the non-deceptive placebos, does that terrify the pharmaceutical companies? And do you think they'll come out with any counter studies to keep their pockets lined, if you will?
Yeah, another great question, and something that is absolutely happening. I don't know all the ins and outs, but this is an idea that the placebo effect itself, and then the non-deceptive placebo idea, when it was originated, I mean, it was very much rejected by the pharmaceutical companies, and the pharmaceutical companies have tried to reinterpret a lot of the evidence that's out there for the placebo effect itself. And I think a lot of the resistance that we've seen to this kind of work is that people will say, well, the evidence so far is just on people's self-reported experience, so they must be lying to you, right? So they can't possibly be feeling less pain because of a placebo. It's not a biological effect. So that's what we were hoping to do with this brain data that we were showing, is actually suggesting to people that they can feel better actually does change their biology in a meaningful way that could make them feel better. And this is kind of at the crux of where I find just this research the most fascinating, which is, I think we forget that psychology is rooted in the brain and the mind is rooted in the brain, and that what changes the mind or what changes psychology they're not separate things, right? So the mind is connected is in the brain. The brain is connected to the body is connected to the brain. All these things are happening together. And so we have the ability to change real physical experiences with psychology.
Excellent question. So I got a couple of couple of people ask questions private message. So I may be going a little out of order from the chat window, but
okay.
Catherine asked me, this may be a little bit outside your area of expertise, but she said that she heard yesterday that there was some success with depression and anxiety using mushrooms. So she asked if you had any comment on that.
Yeah, psilocybin is becoming more popular for at least the study and the treatment of depression, and magic mushrooms, and the kind of the ingredient is psilocybin. There have been a number of positive trials, and I think there's just going to be more and more interest in that. I think you'll see more and more interest in that, and more kind of widely available possibilities as more and more states legalize things like marijuana and other psychedelics, or CBD is another one. So I think people are trying to find a lot of alternatives. The question will be, how safe these things are long term, I guess, which we really don't know the long term effects of using psilocybin or magic mushrooms for depression.
The next question is from Sandy. She asked, does anxiety run in families? Or she also asked, is there a neurotransmitter missing or defective in the anxious brain, perhaps?
Yeah, anxiety does run in families, for sure. Why it runs in families, I think, is one of those classic combination sort of answers, which is it's likely due somewhat to genetic inheritance and somewhat to the environment you're brought up in, right? So not every kid born to an anxious parent becomes anxious, because maybe the environment, the home environment is not that stressful, or they find non-stressful environments with their peers or other caregivers. And so it's this real combination of factors of the environment and genes. But you definitely see a higher proportion of anxiety in children who were born to anxious parents. In terms of the neurotransmitters, issue, I think at the end of the day, because of how complex these traits actually are and these experiences are, it's going to be due to a multitude of neurotransmitter systems, not just one. The serotonin hypothesis that was out there for a long time for depression, for instance, has pretty much been debunked in large part because of the placebo work that they've shown. How could you possibly get a giant placebo effect in 80% of patients if it's not acting on serotonin, if serotonin were so important? So I think that idea of a single neurotransmitter being responsible, that's pretty much not really believed anymore. And it's a complex set of neurotransmitter systems, endocrine systems, hormones. It's going to be a lot of different stuff.
They're all good questions so far. So Sandra asked about brain gym. She said brain gym works in a similar way, meaning that if you rub your forehead, you'll remember what you learned. If only that worked for my final this morning. She asked, is this scientifically valid?
As far as I know, in terms of brain gym and rubbing your forehead, I don't know that evidence. I don't know the evidence for brain gym, but I know of nothing to support that. As far as I know, there may be something, but I don't know. But I will say these kind of brain games out there in the stratosphere, of which you can find many in the App Store and all over the place. These brain games, I would say, to just be an informed consumer, most of them have not actually been empirically studied, and most of them that have been empirically studied have shown to not be that effective. A colleague of mine in psych, Zach Hambrick, actually kind of lifted up the curtain on one of the main companies that had been doing some of this brain training stuff a few years ago now. Why can't I think? Oh, Lumosity, if you've heard of them. They basically were debunked because their strategies were really not helping people's cognition improve. So just be an informed consumer and try to check it out. Some things could be helpful, but a lot are not. At least how they say they are. Maybe placebo.
Good question from Sandra. Elaine asked, have you actually used this? I think by this she's referring to the deceptive placebo. Have you used this yet in one of your clinical settings?
No, we have not used the non-deceptive placebo in the clinical setting yet, because we're really just looking. I mean, these are the first studies that have been done using this sort of method on stress and anxiety, and so we've got a lot to learn before we do that. I have used some of the third-person self-talk with clients, though, who I see some anxious and depressed clients, and you know, we've seen some success with it, but that one I feel a little more confident in because we have a bunch of studies now that show that that can be helpful. But yeah, I'm interested to see how these things will actually end up really working in people's hands. You know, will they be as helpful as we hope they will be? Stay tuned.
Yeah.
Questions keep rolling. Next question is Dr. Waller. So I'll let him ask it.
Hi, Jason. Thank you. That was really wonderful.
Yeah.
I've always felt that I'm completely powerless in the face of my amygdala. I find the kind of self-talk I'm often told to do really ineffective. And I can recall reading about the architecture of the brain, that all the nerves which go from our prefrontal cortex back to the amygdala, I mean, it makes me sound like little English country roads full of sheep. You don't make much progress. Whereas in the other direction, it sounds like a super highway. And that certainly relates to my experience of feeling that the amygdala is in charge. Talking it down is extremely difficult. Does that make neurological sense? And if it does, how often is it possible to use self-talk, given that it would require enormous sustained energy over long periods of time to correct the source of anxiety?
Yeah, no, it's a great question and put really well. The way our brains are wired, they do make sense. They make sense for the survival of the species. That's why it's rigged that way. It's purposefully, but it is rigged that way by, natural selection or what have you, that we need to protect ourselves. Number one, right? We need to stay alive. That's what humans and all, most living organisms, right? That's what they want to do, is stay alive. And so that direction from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex has to be the super highway to the back road to keep us alive. That's at least across history and where we find ourselves in 2020. That's how our brains have evolved. So it does make sense. And it's likely changed over thousands of years, where we know, if you look at primate brains, how those brains are similar yet still different from human brains. You can see how the evolution of the brain has basically, the frontal part of the brain has been the part of the brain that has evolved the most in recent, human history, from primates to humans. And that's where that work has been done. We've essentially over, millennia built more and more of a wall up front to protect against this amygdala driven superhighway. But the way our treatments work, because we're also such verbal people, right? I mean, we're a verbal and social species. And so the way that we kind of work on our problems is through thought and through thinking and through talking. And it's such a natural thing for us to do, that's usually how we ask each other to regulate our emotions. And it is difficult. And this is why we continue to try to find ways to, in a way, hack the brain. So the self-talk, part of the reason that we did the third person self-talk rather than relying on reappraisal and these other reinterpretation strategies, is because the brain data really suggests that just talking to yourself in the third person literally like hijacks the part of your brain that is responsible for determining, is it me I'm referring to, or is it you, John, that I'm referring to? That part of the brain is really good at distinguishing that. So as soon as I start saying Jason, that part of the brain switches. It's like, oh, I'm talking about somebody else. And so the superhighway from the amygdala gets kind of automatically stopped because it's like, oh, don't worry about that. I'm talking about some other Jason, naturally speaking, because anytime I utter Jason, I must be talking about somebody else, just in my experience. And so it just literally hacks that part of the brain to make it more likely that you're going to give yourself advice. And that's what happens for that example is I don't love flying. I do it all the time when I can actually fly. But I don't love flying. And I've used this third person self-talk on myself all the time when I'm going through turbulence. And I just get, just give it a try. It's kind of wild that I'll be sitting there and all of a sudden I'm thinking, I'm shaking. I'm like, Jason's afraid the plane's going to go down. Jason hates turbulence. This plane's going to crack in half. at 30,000 feet. What the hell am I doing at 30,000 feet? Why am I 5 miles in the air? What the heck does that look like? This is terrible. Jason really hates this. And all of a sudden, about 30 seconds into that, all of a sudden I start saying, oh, but Jason knows air travel is the safest kind of travel. Jason knows, he gets in his car all the time, and that's actually more dangerous than is flying in a plane. Jason's been on thousands of flights and things have turned out. So you kind of just naturally already start talking to yourself as if it's somebody else. And that's what we're trying to rely on, is those sorts of kind of hacks, rather than trying to say, I need to think about me and my problems and how am I going to make sense of that. And the truth is, my last little point here is that the therapies we have are okay, but a lot of people don't respond and a lot of people relapse. So the truth is, back to your point, John, is that yes, the amygdala generally wins out, right? Because it will take over, and really building those frontal walls takes a lot of effort and takes a lot of practice.
Dr. Waller, ever the scholar. Any more questions? I actually had an additional question. Mine's specific to COVID times. Do you, as a clinical psychologist, as a researcher, do you find that coronavirus-related stress, is it fundamentally different than other types of stress? Is it more or less the same? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so far, the evidence I've seen is that it is similar in many ways to stressors and anxieties that we kind of know about. And, there are different levels of that, though. So, obviously, it's a different situation, and there are elements of it that are going to be different, right? Because this is the first time in 100 years, an entire population is dealing with this sort of thing. But in terms of the way it works and the symptoms that you see, I think they're very similar still. I mean, people describing fatigue, people describing, sweatiness or weight gain or weight loss, depending on kind of their tendencies, dreams, right? I don't know how many people on this call have had COVID dreams, but I've had a ton. And, this is also how stress plays out. I've had dreams where I met up with my buddies back in high school, and all of a sudden I start hugging them, and then I start thinking, and somehow, my brain starts meta thinking on that, being like, whoa, why are we hugging? What's going on? Has coronavirus passed? Why would I be hugging people? And then I wake up in a sweat. So these are all things that people have experienced with chronic stress. It's just that this is a chronic stress, not just an acute stress like studying for a test, right? Which, it has an end date to it. This is a chronic ongoing stress, which means it is going to end up being kind of more analogous to longer term chronic stressors that people experience. That could be people who tend to have experienced chronic stress with anxiety disorders, let's say. But it also may be akin to the chronic stress that you see in active war zones, for instance, right? That it might actually look a little bit more like a PTSD reaction you might end up having because it's a protracted and life-threatening stress that's happening. It might also be akin to chronic and protracted stress of structural racism that folks feel all the time and feel that very strongly for protracted periods of time. So I think there are examples of what this is akin to kind of across the range of anxiety and stress responses. It's and so I think there's reason to feel like we have strategies to be helpful, and we have ways to address it, but that it's on just such a larger scale than anything we generally work with.
Thank you. I appreciated that response, but I would like to push back on one of your claims that your anxiety for a test ends at the day of the test. My experience as an undergrad is that
Fair enough.
It's more cyclical than anything.
Yes, that's fair.
Carol had a question. She asked, how important is it to be aware of your dreams?
I don't know. I just generally find them interesting. you know, there's kind of regurgitated mashups of the day, right? Or thoughts that you're having. I don't necessarily think they have any particular meaning or deeper meaning or anything. I generally think they reflect what's on your mind or what might be on your mind. And, you know, I think reflecting on them can be informative sometimes, but I don't think they have to be, you know, taken literally or too seriously either.
Good question. Anybody else have any questions? Any last questions? Okay. Oh, no, Dr. Waller.
John's got another one.
Can I squeeze, just one last question? Sandy asked about the genetic component in anxiety.
Yeah.
We have this elaborate apparatus to allow us to feel anxious and very unhappy, which could often feel like an enemy within. It's extremely debilitating, and in our early evolutionary history, it must have resulted in quite a number of people having their lives shortened. Yeah, they don't move as fast, they're not as alert, and so on. So why would natural selection lumber us with all of this? Why couldn't it select for us to be more instinctually happy?
Yeah, again, I think the primitive drive of all species is to protect and to avoid bad things. And I just don't, I mean, maybe, I don't know, 30,000, 40,000, a million years into the future, maybe we'll be there, John. But for now, we're just too close to the beginning of time to see the next iterations of adaptation. You know, it's still true though, right? In our current environment, there's a shortage of resources. There's competition for resources. You have to protect yourself against those resources being taken away from you or losing those resources. And so, you know, there is this constant push-pull that we all experience. And at the end of the day, right, the number one drive is to stay alive. And so that will, until the environment changes such that there is zero competition, which I don't know what that kind of world looks like. I think it will kind of always be with us because we need to protect as a number one priority.
Everyone had excellent questions today. I thought that was
yeah, I appreciate it.
It feels like we're winding down a bit here. So yeah. I would just like to thank everyone again for coming and continuing to support the Town and Gown series. It's really nice to see you all every single week, whether or not this is your first time coming or if you're a repeat customer. And we encourage you to go and keep coming to these. You really, you know, the more participation, the better, really, as far as I'm concerned. And we'd also like to thank Dr. Moser again for donating his time to this endeavor today. It was really a fascinating and timely discussion.
Yeah, thank you everybody for your engagement, your questions. Really nice to see you all and get to chat. Really appreciate it. Everybody be well, be safe, and have a happy holiday.
Thank you again, Jason. And please come back next week when Dr. Betsy Sneller from the Department of Linguistics is going to be talking about language change brought about by the current pandemic. So thank you all. Okay. Good night.
Take care.